I saw my life branching out before me, like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest. Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar. In January 1963, a slim novel appeared in London bookshops under the name Victoria Lucas. Its author, who has chosen a pseudonym partly to protect her mother and partly out of an instinct to protect self preservation. She was Sylvia Plath. The book was Bell Jar. Within a month, its real author was dead, and within a decade, it would become one of the most important novels of the 20th century. The story is deceptively simple in its architecture. Esther Greenwood, a brilliant young woman from New England, wins a coveted guest editorship at a prestigious New York fashion magazine in the summer of 1953. She arrives in the city, stylish, curious, clever, and proceeds to feel almost nothing. The glamour slides off her like the rain of glass. The parties bore her, the men confuse her. The future, laid out before her in gleaming possibility, strikes her not as an invitation but as a threat. This is the novel's central vertiginous irony. The protagonist is exactly where every young woman of her time was, supposed to want to be young, attractive, accomplished in New York, and she is secretly coming apart. Plath had lived the summer. She has been that woman in that city, and she understood that the gap between what the world sees and what the self feels is not merely uncomfortable, it can be catastrophic. When Esther returns home to suburban Boston, she finds that she has been rejected from a prestigious creative writing program. The rejection cracks something open. She cannot sleep, she cannot read, she cannot write. She sits for days without bathing, a figure from whom all the ordinary mechanism of selfhood have been quietly withdrawn. What follows, the hospitalization, the electroconvulsive therapy, the slow, fragile, uncertain recovery, is rendered by Plath with a clarity that is almost unbearable in its precision. She does not make mental illness poetic, she makes it real. Plath gives her protagonist an image for the condition. To the person in the bell jar, blank and stopped as a dead baby, the world itself is the bad dream. The bell jar is a glass vessel that descends over a person and traps them inside their own air, their own thoughts, their own distorted atmosphere. The world outside continues. People move, laugh, love, make plans. But the person under the bell jar watches all from behind the glass, unable to participate, unable to breathe freely, unable to escape the stale recycling of their own despair. It is one of literature's most precise and devastating metaphors for depression, and it is rendered with such intimacy, such an insider's knowledge of the texture of that particular suffering, that it offered recognition and therefore relief to countless readers over the past 60 years since the novel's publication. If the bell jar is the novel's image of suffering, the fig tree is its image of desire and of the particular torture that desire can become when it is not permitted to choose. Esther imagines her life as a great fig tree in full fruit. Each fig represents a possible future self: the famous poet, the brilliant professor, the loving mother, the world traveler, and the Olympic fencer. Distinct, dazzling, equally available. She sits beneath the tree, starving, desperate to choose, unable to move, because to choose one fig is to let all the others rot, and so, paralyzed, she watches them fall. One by one, they blacken and drop under the ground beneath. The tree is covered in their shriveled remains. This metaphor captures something that goes far beyond a single fictional woman's anxiety. It captures the specific historical paralysis of the mid 20th century educated woman, a person for whom possibility has been opened just far enough to make the closing of it agonizing. Women of Esther's generation were the first to attend the Ivy League, to pursue careers, to imagine futures that extended beyond the domestic, and yet every social structure around them was still architected to funnel them back towards marriage, motherhood, and silence. The victory is not merely a crisis of indecision, it is inevitable consequence of being offered freedom in theory and denied it in practice. Esther does not fail to choose because she is weak. She fails to choose because every choice demands annihilation of a self she has equally valid claims to. This is the tragedy Plath diagnosed with such surgical accuracy, that a woman who wants everything, career, love, art, adventure, identity, etc., is not treated as ambitious. She is treated as impossible. Esther Greenwood is surrounded by women who have made their peace with this enclosure. Her mother, who sublimates herself to sectarial work and quiet devotion. Her college friend, Dodo Conway, who pushes a pram of children through the neighborhood with beatic contentment. Esther watches these women with a mixture of envy and horror. She cannot do what they do. She cannot pour herself into those molds, but the molds are the only shape on offer. The novel's most viscerally feministic passage concerns Esther's rage at the double standards governing sexuality. Men, including Buddy Villard, her handsome, respectable suitor, may accumulate sexual experience and emerge unscathed, their reputations burnished rather than tarnished. Women who attempt the same are ruined. Esther refuses this bargain with a fury that is entirely rational and yet socially illegible. Her refusal contributes to her isolation. Her isolation contributes to her breakdown. The novel draws a straight, unflinching line between social injustice and psychological collapse. It is, in this sense, a profoundly political novel, not polemic but political, in the way that all serious fiction about private experience is political. It insists that private and the political are not separate spheres. The bell jar does not descend from within Esther's alone. It is lowered over her by the history, by expectations, by combined weight of society that cannot accommodate the fullness of what she is. The bell jar arrives its deepest resonances when read alongside the great French existentialist tradition that was in the late 1950s and early 1960s, shaking the foundations of the Western thought. Sartre, Beauvoir, Camus. These were the writers who asked, with a kind of beautiful relentlessness, what it means to exist without a pre given essence, what it means to choose a self in a world that offers no guarantee and demands no consistency. For Sartre, the human being has no fixed nature, no soul, no essence, no predetermined rules. We exist first, and then we make ourselves through the choices we make. This is exhilarating and it is terrifying. It means that we are condemned to be free, responsible for everything we are and everything we become. Esther Greenwood faces precisely this terror. She has no predetermined self to fall back on, and yet every structure around her is attempting to assign her one. Beauvoir's foundational claim that femininity is a social construction, a role imposed upon biological female persons from birth, illuminates Esther's crisis with devastating clarity. Esther is not failing to become a woman. She is refusing to become the kind of woman that 1950s America demands of her. Her resistance is not pathology. It is, in Beauvoir's framework, the first movement of authentic self creation, and society punishes it as madness. Camus argued that fundamental question of philosophy is why one should not commit suicide, and that the honest answer requires confronting the absurdity of existence without flinching. Esther Greenwood confronts this absurdity directly. Her survival, her fragile recovery at the novel's end, is not a resolution. It is a Sisyphean choice to keep going, not because the world has been made sensible, but because the self insists on existing. Sartre's concept of bad faith, the self deception by which we pretend we have no freedom in order to avoid the responsibility of choosing, describes precisely what Esther refuses to practice. She will not pretend that the available rules are sufficient. She will not perform contentment she does not feel. Her honesty destroys her temporarily, but it is also the only possible basis for a self she could live in. Esther tells us at the novel's end that there is no permanent cure, no once and for all rescue. There is only the ongoing daily, effortful business of remaining in the world, remaining in one's own life, breathing the available air. This is not a hopeful ending in any conventional sense, but it is an honest one. And in Plath, honesty was always the highest form of hope. She did not write to console, she wrote to see clearly, and seeing clearly, even especially when what is seen is difficult to bear, is the beginning of any genuine reckoning with what it is to be alive. Sylvia Plath was a woman who wanted everything the world had to offer, and who lived in a world that had not yet learned to offer it. She wrote from within that contradiction with extraordinary precision, extraordinary courage, and extraordinary art. 60 years after her death, the bell jar she described remains, for many readers, the most accurate map of an interior county they thought no one else had visited. She visited it, she wrote it down, she left us the direction. This brings me to the contemporary relevance of this novel. This novel offers two metaphors, the bell jar and the fig tree. To exist under the bell jar is not simply to suffer, it is to be enclosed within one's own consciousness in such a way that the world becomes distant. And the second central metaphor is the fig tree. Esther imagines her life as a tree laden with possibility. Each fig represents a different future, intellectual, domestic, creative, adventurous. Each is equally desirable, equally real, and yet she is unable to choose, because to choose one is to relinquish all others. What follows is not liberation, but paralysis. This is a crucial insight. The problem is not the absence of opportunities, but the structure of opportunity itself. When multiple equally compelling futures are presented without a framework for reconciliation, choice becomes not an act of freedom, but a site of anxiety. If Greenwood's crisis emerged in a world that restricted women's choices, the modern condition is marked by something more paradoxical, an expansion of choice that is not necessarily translated into clarity or ease. Today, women inhabit a social landscape in which education, professional ambition, and economic independence are not only permitted but encouraged, and at the same time, the expectations surrounding marriage, family formation, and caregiving has not receded. The result is not a simple conflict between tradition and modernity, but a layering of demands. Women are no longer asked to choose one role over another. They are increasingly expected to successfully integrate multiple and often competing roles: professional, domestic, emotional, social. This produces not liberation in any uncomplicated sense, but a condition of sustained negotiation. It is within this context that the metaphor of fig tree acquires renewed analytical force. The problem is no longer the absence of opportunity, but the structure of abundance. When multiple life paths, career advancement, marriage, motherhood, self-development, are all simultaneously valorized, the act of choosing becomes fraught. Each decision carries with it the implicit loss of alternative self. What appears as freedom at the level of structure can manifest at the level of experience as hesitation, deferral, and in some cases paralysis. This condition is further complicated by the persistence of patriarchal norms, albeit in more diffuse and less overt forms. While formal barriers may have weakened, informal expectations continue to shape decision making. Within such a framework, the relationship between material success and inner well being becomes increasingly unstable. Contemporary societies tend to equate fulfillment with measurable achievement, career progression financial security, social visibility. However, as Platt's work suggests, and as present conditions continue to demonstrate, external success does not necessarily correspond to internal coherence. Individuals may achieve what is socially prescribed and yet experience a persistent sense of misalignment between what they are doing and what they feel, between the roles they perform and the selves they inhabit. This disjunction is not easily articulated within dominant narratives of success, which often leaves little room for ambivalence or dissatisfaction. In this sense, depression can no longer be understood solely as an isolated phenomena. It must also be read in relation to broader structural conditions. The pressure to optimize multiple aspects of life simultaneously, the absence of clear hierarchies of value, and the internalization of expectations that may be mutually incompatible. The enduring insight offered by the bell jar is that psychological distress is not always the result of failure or deficiency. It can emerge equally from environments that demand too much and in too many directions without providing adequate framework for integration. Thus, the novel's relevance today lies in its ability to illuminate a distinctly modern predicament. Not the lack of choice, but the weight of it. Not exclusion, but overextension. Not the denial of possibility, but the difficulty of living meaningfully. Which brings me to one of my favorite Sylvia Plath quote. I took a deep breath and listened to the old brag of my heart. I am, I am, I am. Thank you.